Hello and good morning to everybody. We are here for the digital launch of Iqbal's book, which is already a bestseller, I believe, and rightly so. Red Fear, The China Threat. I think many of you are familiar with this book and the cover, which has been designed by Iqbal, by the way, who's many things rolled into one. Author, filmmaker, uh, you know, uh, he's a design specialist, and more importantly, I found him to be in an interesting way a renaissance man. He seems to have multiple interests. I mean, he's also a doctor for advice if you want to ever go to one, because he seems to know how to deal with every problem that the human body has. But more importantly, here is his solution on how to deal with China. Now, this doesn't apply only to the Sino-Indian context, because China has suddenly come into the news in India, because for too long we seem to have a veil around the fact of the games that China continues to play. Iqbal has been a sinologist, or you can call him a China watcher, and he has been observing China and its behavioral patterns after many visits to China, Tibet, everywhere else, at least over the last 3 to 4 decades. And I think this was a book that was already there inside him, and he got encouraged to put it into uh, the form of a hardback, which I believe, should be a paperback very soon also, because of the sheer ability of this book to reach out across the world. And I wouldn't say just in India. And I've been pushing Iqbal to try and ensure this becomes a global bestseller, not just an India bestseller, because it's such a fabulous book with so much of information and such a wealth of knowledge. Um, Iqbal and I jointly authored a book on Kashmir last year, Kashmir's Untold Story, which I believe has done very well. And that kind of encouraged Iqbal, not that he needed a reassurance for his cerebral inclinations. So let me now get to Iqbal. Iqbal, you had a reasonably long introduction, more than what I give to many people on television. You've been on some of my shows. But briefly, can you just tell us that what is it that the book is looking at, and it's come out at the right time, but are there lessons for us from what China has a strategy to deal with India, which was long since in the making? I mean, you've talked about China-Russia relations, you've talked about earlier empires coming into India, and you've talked about Mao's expansionist agenda. So encapsulate all that and let us have a look at what your book is really, I mean, what is the key issues that you try and bring up?
Thank you, Maroof, and thank you for this glorious introduction, which is very flattering. Well, I'll just make 3 quick points. Firstly, the book reveals the fact that India and China have had an antagonistic relationship for the last few centuries. And particularly since the 19th century, this relationship became antagonistic because the Indian army and the Indian economy, which was both under British rule, were geared towards suppressing and milking the Chinese economy and the Chinese state of its power and authority, because there were Indian soldiers under British officers in China for 100 years, from 1839 to 1939. Secondly, the book reveals the real reason why Mao Zedong attacked India. And that reason was to protect the Chinese nuclear program in Loknor, which is close to Aksai Chin. And this fact was obscured. The book goes into great detail and explains the genesis of the dispute in the region of Xinjiang, Aksai Chin, all the changes that happened as a result of the Soviet nuclear program and the Soviet interest in that area to mine for uranium, thorium, beryllium, molybdenum, and the British necessity to become a nuclear power, and the reasons for the British wanting to actually carve out a separate state of Kashmir, which would be under the Pakistani jurisdiction, because Pakistan was willing to permit British bases to remain in that occupied Kashmir to mount Soviet tests. And the third reason is that it is a fallacy that China is willing to accept India as a friend, because today China is facing an existential crisis because the US has invoked a trade ban on the sale of microprocessors, which are very vital for Chinese industry to thrive and flourish, and for Chinese technology to remain supreme in the world. And these microprocessors need a lot of water, and the Indus River and its four tributaries of the Galwan River, the Changchemo River, the Nubra River, the Shyok River, all flow into Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And within 200 kilometers of the 100 to 200 kilometers of the border of the line of control, the Chinese have constructed, are in the process of constructing two major dams, the Daimar Bhasha Dam and the Bunji Dam, at a cost of around $15 billion, to harness the potential of this water, to store it, to use in secret factories in southern Xinjiang or in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, hidden inside the mountainside, to make microprocessors, because this is vital for the survival of Chinese supremacy in the world today. So this is basically, these are the 3 points that the book brings out.
Yeah, in fact, I've drawn on a lot of it, primarily also the last point, coincidentally. My this weekend's Latitude show on Times Now is exactly about China's water agenda. And we've talked about the rivers both in Aksai Chin and on the Tibetan plateau that China has continued to sort of exploit. Tibet brings me to the point that, Tibet is really central to any discussion around China. Your book covers it in many aspects. It's, the agenda of the British after Young Husband's expedition, the Russians coming into Tibet again, and the British being wary of it, and that led to these bases in Gilgit-Baltistan and monitoring Russian nuclear activities by the Brits. Mao Zedong often talking about Tibet being very important to China's strategic aims, the palm and 5 fingers. And India, of course, sliding down a path that was laid out for India by the Chinese, and Nehru happily blindfolded and still thought he was doing the right thing. So the question that comes to me is, why is Tibet so crucial now for China's long-term strategic aims? Because the world really looks at China with the growth story that is publicized on the east coast of China. Tibet is pretty much under the wraps even now. They call it Tibet Autonomous Region, which is a farce. Why, having exploited the territorial and natural wealth of Tibet, which you would agree is drawing to its close in terms of what more they can exploit? They've ruined the soil quality there. They've ruined the water there because of the fallout of the nuclear tests in Lopnor. But beyond that, what is it that China now needs Tibet for in terms of how it is seen by the Western world? And they've all gone down that path of investing in China's east coast.
Maroof, let me be very clear that Tibet today is the lifeblood of our civilization on the Indo-Gangetic plain and the civilization along the shores of the Brahmaputra River in Assam. Because all our rivers, the headwaters of the Indus, the Satluj, the Karnali, the Ganga, and Brahmaputra start in Tibet. Lake Mansarovar is a very vital lake, and near Lake Mansarovar there's Rakshastal, where the legend is that Ravan did his tapasya before Shiva so that he could get his boon of immortality. Now, this is all part of our folklore, mythology, religion in India, and was an area of vital economic interest. And in the past, there were no borders that defined control because the culture and the language and religion, the writ of it, wherever it extended, that was the border of that land, of that civilization. So today, China has a stranglehold on our water, and without our water, we are dead. I mean, in historical times, the civilization on the banks of the Saraswati River perished, and so there was a movement eastwards towards the Ganges. Similarly, now where will we move? Where will this vast population of our country go if our water supply is choked off? So that's one very important fact. Secondly, for the defense of India, the Himalayas were often touted by Prime Minister Nehru that this is an impenetrable wall that will defend India from all invasions and from the Chinese invasion as well. But that fallacy has been proved wrong. Today, in the month of December 2020, our troops are eyeball to eyeball with the Chinese along the LAC, all the way from, you can say, Daulat Beg, Oldie, down to Wallong in Arunachal Pradesh. So we are defending that because technology has enabled the Chinese to circumvent the natural barrier. Now, the Tibet is also very vital for China's land thrust into Europe, for the Belt and Road Initiative, for the ability of the Chinese to pump oil and gas from Gwadar on Pakistan's Makran coast all the way up to Xinjiang. And it is a very vital part of China, even more so than southern China, because if China is under pressure on the east, on the west, there is no challenge to Chinese hegemony today. There is no challenge. The Russians have been completely subdued by China. In fact, there are so many Chinese in Siberia that if Mr. Putin had any sense, he would ask for Indians to come and settle in Siberia. Ex-Indian servicemen to settle in Siberia to counter the Chinese, because if the Russians go against the Chinese can just send swarms of their people into Siberia, and it's a very mineral-rich and resource-rich area. So I think that this whole focus on the south and southeast of China is not actually correct, because for the Chinese, the west and the northwest are equally important.
Okay, very well brought out. But just a small add-on to the point you made. How is it possible to deny a lower riparian country like India access to waters? Can you control the river flow of massive rivers completely?
Maroof, they already done it with the Brahmaputra. And they're trying to do it in the western sector by controlling there is global warming. And as a consequence of global warming, there's glacial melt. And as a consequence of glacial melt, there's a surge in waters that flow through the western rivers. And this surge is going to continue for another 30 years, after which it will all dry up if this global warming continues at this rate. And that's the surge that they wanted to capture. That's the reason why the Galwan Valley becomes so important. That's the reason why Eastern Ladakh is so important. Because it is my argument, and you may say it is a far-fetched conspiracy theory, but it is my argument that the Chinese wish to extend their borders in Ladakh up to the eastern bank of the Indus. That's their wish list. And they are trying their level best to ensure that we do not thwart them. We built up the infrastructure in the last few years, which is a good thing, to protect ourselves. And we've also shown the resolve to stand up and fight them. So this is now a very big deterrent in their pursuit of their goals.
Okay, we can keep arguing about the water aspect, because then it'll digress from what else is in your book. But by and large, what you have to say about the waters has a lot of merit. I think the problem at our level has been that we don't seem to have a counter strategy at this stage or at a later stage, even, for example, to deal with Pakistan, which is a beneficiary of the most generous water treaty, the Indus Waters Treaty, which again China is exploiting in the POK area. So that's another story altogether. But let me go back to a couple of other points. One is, the legacy of Mao. And you've talked a lot about it in your book, and how Mao shaped China's agenda in so many ways. One interesting aspect is that Mao believed that nature should be exploited for China's growth and China's place in the world, and not vice versa is how the world is looking at, you know, absorbing what nature has to offer, but at the same time finding ways where we don't exploit nature to the extent that nature can't support our existence. Now, where is it that China would be pushed by the international community to draw the line? Because China seems to, even now, as we've seen post COVID, the only major country that's bounced back, has a system that is delivering as per its growth agenda. Growth everywhere has suffered. But China is offering the other option to a lot of developing and third world countries, that that's the model we should go to. So, A, to what extent can China be allowed to exploit nature, both water and other resources? B, is China now the go-to country post-COVID for the third world?
You see, Maroof, you got to understand the Chinese psyche. The Chinese, the Han Chinese, which was the dominant the dominant ethnic component of China, have been for 3.5 centuries dominated by the Manchus. And the resurgence of the Han Chinese took place at the time of the Chinese Revolution in 1911, when Sun Yat-sen raised the banner of revolt and overthrew the Qing dynasty, and with it the oppression of the Han people. So they were an oppressed people. And this articulation of Chinese expansionism and Chinese hegemony and China's role as the beacon of the world and the epicenter of the universe was all a part of Chinese aspirations going back several hundred years BC. And this was a wish that they wished to have fulfilled. But unfortunately for them, first Cyrus the Great was a world conqueror, then there was Alexander the Great, and then there was Genghis Khan. The Chinese were left behind. So Mao decided to take on that role and institutionalize this whole process. So the Chinese have aspired for hegemony, and they do not believe that their system can be replicated. What they are saying is that you have run your own system, but you accept us as the overlord and you as a vassal state. So all of Southeast Asia become vassal states of the Chinese overlord. So I mean, that is basically the thrust of their political framework and their political philosophy. So so that's the thinking that lies behind all of that. Now the question is that how do we deal with China today? The undeniable fact is that China is the factory of the world. It has become the factory of the world by ruthlessly exploiting Chinese labor. And this has enabled the Chinese to manufacture practically everything from toothpicks to computer chips at a cost which cannot be replicated anywhere in the world, because everywhere in the world you don't have such an authoritarian or autocratic system. Now the question is that can you recalibrate and re-industrialize the deindustrialized rest of the world because of Chinese policies? I mean, I don't think that is possible. So the fact of the matter is that we are going to continue to need China to be the factory of the world because it produces at the lowest cost. Now the question is that what is the danger in this? The danger in this is that the Chinese have managed to create a trade framework where the terms of trade are weighed in their favor and against the rest of the world. This has enabled the Chinese to accumulate vast balances running into trillions of dollars. These reserves have enabled the Chinese to spread their message of global hegemony everywhere. Now the question is that how does the rest of the world deal with this Chinese expansionism? How do they curb the power of the Chinese ruling elite to not use these reserves for global political expansion and global political oppression? So the question is that can only happen if the Chinese leadership is changed, because the current Chinese leadership believes that this is the way forward. So how do we actually get this thing going is something that is difficult to assess right now. And I think the ultimate unspoken goal of the Quad nations and the rest of the world is that some kind of alternate Chinese leadership from within the Chinese Communist Party displaces the leadership of Mr. Xi Jinping, and they moderate their use of their economic reserves, their balances, and do not promote this whole paradigm of global hegemony.
Well, I know. I mean, that seems to be now the Western goal when the West itself propped him and his colleagues up to the extent that they are unmanageable now. And I don't share the optimism of the Western countries in being able to deal with the Chinese, because one is that because they are a concert of democracies, they will keep arguing till the cows come home. As far as the Chinese are concerned, I think Xi Jinping is a mascot of a system, and the system is too powerful, short of a huge global conflict, which will then, in the manner that Hitler and others went crumbling down, will have an alternative. I mean, and I don't think even that may alter things, because you had a totalitarian system in Russia, and that still didn't was done away with at the end of the World War. But there are two issues that I want you to deliberate a bit more on, because I think people need to understand that China's dominance of the global narrative not only comes out of their multi-trillion-dollar reserves, but also comes out of the fact that they are working to a plan. The plan is to try and have tech dominance, to have Chinese unrestricted warfare unleashed on systems, even including India. And while we remain alert on the borders, they could try and eat you up from within. Expound on that.
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting question. It's very difficult to actually encapsulate it into a coherent answer. But let's put it this way: that the Chinese penetration of the world economy and the global political systems of the quote unquote free world uh, were actually, trivialized by the leadership of these countries, because they never expected the Chinese to exercise or want to exercise political domination over all those countries that became dependent to the Chinese factories to sell them goods at cheap prices. And then the Chinese also unleashed a very subtle propaganda warfare. There were some Chinese apps, around in 2012, 2013, and 2014 that I think one was called Love You or Love or something like that, where you could send your message to 500,000 people, and Facebook only allowed you 5,000 friends, and they allowed you 500,000 friends. So whatever message you wanted to send was sent through those apps. And the Chinese encouraged at that time the political opponents of what were called liberal or quasi-liberal regimes in the free world. And a whole range of new political leaders emerged who were much stronger and more authoritarian than had been their predecessors. And they decided to court the Chinese. But then the Chinese stung them. And the Chinese said, hey, you came to power with our support. But today, you have to now offer your tribute to us and recognize the role that we played in the birth of your ascendancy to power. And that's where the primary conflict arises today. And I think that everybody, every leader in the world has a certain modicum of self-respect and dignity. And he doesn't want to be a vassal leader. And normally one tends to forget those that helped us on their rise to power. And in India, there's a famous saying that when you climb a ladder, you cut the steps. that lie behind you on your rise to the top. But then you can't climb down, you have to fall down because it becomes quite difficult to remain perched on top. So this is the kind of issue that Xi Jinping is facing, and it's difficult to say. I mean, I think that the spread of this COVID-19 was viewed by the Chinese as a weapon of opportunity to be exploited, and it was factored into their war game for global dominance. And they felt that countries that were as diverse as Italy, for example, or Australia, would crumble under the onslaught. But the Australians showed a tremendous amount of backbone, that they would resist the Chinese. And even in Italy today, even though the Chinese railway extends well into Italy, and the Chinese have settled 150,000 workers in the region around Lake Como, and despite the close linkages, the Italians are now rising up in revolt against the Chinese. And there's, in fact, a motion in the Italian parliament to investigate this whole reason why the Italian economy has submitted to Chinese overlordship. So there are pockets of resistance. And I think that over a period of time, the world is going to get organized. I think India, Japan, Australia, and the US have taken a right step in actually politicizing and militarizing the Quad, because this is our lifeline of defense for freedom. Freedom of expression, freedom of passage, freedom of thought, freedom of choice. These freedoms are integral to the survival of humanity and mankind. And I don't think that in the long run, any totalitarian construct is going to survive.
Well, this is music to the ears of all those who are, particularly in the West, looking at doing China precisely that. Interesting you bring out Italy, because, I read somewhere that, Wuhan had 3 daily flights from Milan. And I would also argue that, all the Louis Vuitton and Gucci bags that you pick up, they were actually made in China and then branded in Italy and sold. And
Correction. The Chinese labor was imported to make them in Italy, so that the made in Italy mark. There's a Louis Vuitton made in China, but the made in Italy mark could only be put in if it was made by Chinese, if it was made in Italy. And the only way would be to bring the workers in there. That's why the workers came into that area around Milan.
Interesting, because you see, it's these ambitions of Western industrialists, the countries, their agenda to become richer by every turning year has now put them in this spot. But I've also argued that in all probability, the virus entirely, or at least in part, came out of China's Wuhan labs and not so much as the wet markets, but that's a separate issue. What we need to understand is, how is it that the world can wean itself away from China's chips and its chips agenda to have them anywhere and everywhere? I know you've talked about the fact that America has put the stop on Chinese imports, which will allow them to have enough silicon chips and other items which will feed the agenda of $1 trillion ambition that they have for companies like Huawei. But short of a conflict is which China might do to attack a country like Taiwan, which has the big chip manufacturing outfit TSMC. What is it that we can see which will allow the world and India, which continues to flatter itself that it's the IT superpower of the world, but it's basically the back office of the IT superpowers? I would say that. Can you give us a detailed explanation, and can you tell me that India has a hope in hell, apart from the chest thumping that we do, that we can come anywhere close to what China's agenda is and its growth plans are?
You see, Maroof, the thing is this, that firstly, there's a Cold War which is on now, which is on the verge of getting hot, and this is the technology Cold War. The Americans have blocked the Chinese access to technology, and they've tightened their internal security because the Chinese have stolen and replicated, and they have bribed, and they have in every way possible probably blackmailed scientists into selling them technology. In fact, if you in the past wanted to set up a joint venture project in China in order to exploit the Chinese market, you have to provide all your blueprints to the Chinese. So they got this technology free because of the lure of the market. Now, India has rightly chosen the side of the Americans because the choice is either you join the American camp or you join the Chinese camp. Now, there's no in between, there's no non aligned world left because technology is moving at such a rapid pace that you will be left behind and you will be crippled because tomorrow, if the Chinese were to attack our banking system and our power grid without firing a single shot across the borders, the question is how would our political leadership respond to that crisis? You tell me that. Does this country have a plan? We will then, that's why we have signed this last agreement with the Americans, the one that was signed 2 months ago when Mike Pompeo was over here, basically giving us access to American technology and American information to prevent this from happening. So we are in a very vulnerable situation, and we have to wholeheartedly realize that, look, a lot of Indian scientists and a lot of NRIs are in the American political system. And we share certain values with the Americans on democracy, on freedom of speech, thought, and expression. And if we preserve these values and we continue to build ties with the Americans, there's nothing wrong in that because this is the need of the time. Tomorrow, when we are stronger, we can decide to restart non alignment or recalibrate our policy. But at this point of time, at this critical juncture, we have to make a choice. And that choice has to be that are you with the Chinese or are you against them? Now they have pushed you into a corner. So you're against them. So in order to survive, you have to join this camp and in order to grow and thrive. Now, the question is that can we replicate this Chinese system in India? I don't know. Because, we are a diverse country and right now we've got a lot of issues. There's this farmers agitation going on, which is very unfortunate. Then there was a coronavirus thing. Then there were various other agitations in the beginning of this year. So these agitations are sapping the energy of the system. So we need a national consensus because I must reiterate that India is a multi-dimensional continental federal polity where there is a premium on the politics of consensus. And that consensus is very important if our country is going to thrive and become a global power, an economic power, a cultural power, a military power, and is able to tell people, hey, hang on, you can't push us that much. We are not going to be pushed because we have the ability to unleash our retaliatory forces on you like the Americans have. I mean, today we are the closest country in many ways in terms of its diversity, in terms of its multipolarity, in terms of its consensus politics to the Americans. And if the Americans are the leaders of the Western world, we should be the leaders of the Eastern world. And we have a civilization that goes far back behind them. And we have traditions and culture. After all, what is our cultural strength? It's the Bollywood cinema that goes out and it's on par with Hollywood. So that is our strength. Now we can't undermine the strength. We have to build on it. And that's what I think our political consensus needs to look at today. How do we resolve our internal differences and how do we move ahead coherently and become a composite, positive economic, political, and military power?
I know. I agree with you entirely. And just 3 quick points. One is I've argued for some years that India, like America, is an idea. And therefore, we are a sort of a collection of ideas, cultures, civilizations. So, to try and reduce India to a single narrative, single idea nation state is probably the biggest disservice we will do to the idea of India that emerged particularly since independence. And we would then not be mirroring America, but we would be mirroring perhaps China. And that is where I think there is a conflict between those who want one and those who want the other. The other thing is that America, as your book brings out in great detail, was happy to offer India an alliance, and India has always been allergic to an alliance, and therefore we've ended up becoming a strategic partner of America now. But this was offered by Eisenhower in 1949, and Nehru just missed the writing on the wall. Your book, of course, is fairly elaborately brings out, I mean, all of Nehru's strategic follies, and he missed the writing on the wall. Is it that here again, history has given us another chance to recalibrate our policies? Are we going to go into a self congratulatory mode again to say, historically, we've always had these answers, and
Maroof,
historically, we've always done the wrong thing, at least since independence?
yeah,
So,
Maroof, before
what is the real lesson that this fabulous book should have for our policymakers?
Maruf, I want to tell you before I lose the train of thought that I was 9 years old in 1965 when the Pakistanis attacked India. And at that time, we were facing a food crisis. And Lal Bahadur Shastri, who was our Prime Minister, coined the phrase Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. And he also said, miss a meal on Monday evenings. And I remember all of us in the family never used to eat anything on Monday night. Nothing. And that was because we had this food crisis. Now, in the 1960s, there was a red revolution surging through the world. Communism was fighting the capitalists and the market order. And India was also a victim of that. The food crisis and the famine in Bihar brought about the Naxalite movement. And there was bloody violence all over Eastern India. Now, at that point of time, the Congress party had envisaged that if there's a revolution in India, that revolution will come from the urban proletariat. And therefore, they set up a system of food fair price shops, which would provide grain and salt and cooking oil and bulbs and all the essential commodities to the urban proletariat. That is the urban working class, so that that working class would not be collectivized and would not take to the streets and join the ranks of the Red Revolution that was sweeping the whole world. Now, the fact is that the argument was that, look, if you have food in your belly, you are not going to revolt. So the Americans realized the gravity of the crisis that India was facing. They stepped in with PL 480, which of course was the worst kind of wheat that they produced, and that was not to our palates. So they introduced this Taichung native one, which was this rice strain. They introduced high yielding varieties of wheat, and Norman Borlaug and Hargobind Khurana and the Punjab Agricultural University, all of them pitched in, and the Punjabi farmer pitched in. And therefore, we had the Green Revolution. And the purpose of the Green Revolution was to provide the public distribution system with enough subsidized food so that there would be no bloody revolution, so that there would be no discontent in our urban areas. And there would be no political mobilization against the state and against the system that we had in place. Now, if it hadn't been for American aid in 1965, food aid, and then the aid that brought about the Green Revolution, we would not have been where we are today. The Chinese didn't do anything for us. The Russians didn't do anything for us. But the Americans gave us the software to replicate it, and the industriousness of our people, of our farmers, brought about this Green Revolution. Now, today we have surpluses. The government should be thinking about a policy of how do we bring down these surpluses and how can we, shift cultivation. That's what the Chinese would have done to actually grow those kind of crops that can be exported, because India is an agricultural powerhouse. That is our strength. And instead of actually enlisting American, support in doing this thing and using cerebral inputs, we have wasted the last 50 years since the Green Revolution. And look at the state we are in today. I mean, it's not a happy position that we're in today. So the fact of the matter is this, that we have to realize that, look, we need to plan like the Chinese plan. We need to think, we need to have a perspective, we need to have a vision, we need to have a political consensus that this is where we need to go, this is how agriculture should go, this is how industry should grow, this is how information technology should grow, this is how defense should grow. Everything in this country is reactive. Everything is on an ad hoc basis. Let's get proactive. Let's start thinking. Let's start planning, and let's hand over to successive generations the ability to actually think and plan and improvise, because it's a dynamic chessboard. It is not a static board. It is dynamic. There's so many factors coming into play all the time. I'm not a fortune teller, nor am I an astrologer. But I mean, if you look at a crystal ball today, a mythical crystal ball, the future doesn't portend very well for us, because we have to get our act together. We need to gear up and face the challenges and start thinking and start talking and start interacting and start communicating that, look, this is the way out of the crisis. This is the way our economy needs to go. That's what we need to do.
In fact, you've touched on another very important. We're getting short of time, so we'll have to wrap up. But I'm sure your close friend and Niti Aayog would do very well to listen to your advice, because I think what really needs to be done, amongst so many other things, is to revisit the narratives that have come to stay. One of those narratives that is still really in the public domain is that America is the bad guy. And so anything that comes from America must be viewed with suspicion, whether it's military weapon systems or it is agri technology and products. But as you are arguing, that just could be the saving grace for India. And the other aspect, which I think is important, is that for us all to really start doing our bit to make sure that China doesn't continue to dominate all the purchases that we make on a day-to-day basis. It's going to be difficult because their products are competitively priced and definitely high quality. So how do you wean away and go back to Swadeshi is anybody's guess. But I think I'll leave you there, because I think it's been a brilliant exposition on issues connected with China, its agenda, how India needs to really sit back and wake up. And I'll now let them wrap it, or any final thoughts before they wrap it.
So thank you. It's been very illuminating, and I think I'm privileged that we've had this discussion. And I look forward to having many more such chats. My side. So thank you.
It is the same from our side also, sir.
Sorry.
Hello.
Yeah.
On behalf of Starmark, I would really thank you for this beautiful session, and we look forward to have a very good sale of this book also, sir.
Yes, please connect us. I mean, please send us the link so that we can send it to all our friends, and I'm sure that we'll be promoting it on YouTube as well.
Absolutely, sir. We will be sharing everything to you, and of course, we will be looking forward to have a decent sale of this very informative book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.